So we're going to talk about the learning objectives of this evening. And if you look at these, we're defining boundaries and what does that mean. The caretaking versus caregiving, identifying boundary crossing, what does that mean? Defending boundaries, pocket responses, and resentment. So why does this come up? Why do we need to look at boundaries? What does it have to do at all with addictions? Well, if you are involved with someone who uses substances, whether it be a child of yours or a partner of yours or someone you know, someone you care for, then you know that it actually has a lot to do with boundaries, because your entire lives can get changed in so many different ways as a result of having either a child or a partner that has addiction issues, and that can be beyond just alcohol and drugs. But what we are going to mainly focus on, of course, is alcohol and drugs, although the same impacts can be had with any other addiction, obsession or compulsion. So boundaries are key to creating healthy relationships, even when your loved one isn't healthy. Boundaries are key in marriages, friendships, relationships between you and your parents, siblings, co-workers, and more. Think of boundaries as a psychological fence between two people. You're not the same person as anyone else, regardless of your relationship. Boundaries establish guidelines for suitable behaviors, responsibilities, and actions. When your boundaries are weak or don't exist at all, you compromise what makes you, you. Weak boundaries allow you to lose yourself, your freedom, your personal space. Weak boundaries when a loved one is addicted mean you will likely be lied to, cheated on, and stolen from. When you set boundaries with an addicted loved one, you increase the chances that he or she will seek help. So if we look at what they are and how do we get to that point, well, you can tell the telltale signs. I'll tell you some of those. And we will be having some handouts later on. They'll be on a desk over there. But we also have lots of material that is available online. I'll give you some places you can go to online if you want some definitive answers or even a booklet that you can use. But here are some of the telltale signs that you need to set boundaries or strengthen your existing boundaries. You bring up what he or she has done wrong in the past. You send him or her on guilt trips. You are constantly telling him or her what to do and warning what will happen if they don't do it. You criticize. You give solutions when you haven't been asked. You cover for him or her. You lie for them, call in sick for work, pick them up, or take them to and from the bar. You are taken advantage of or stolen from. And finally, the last one is you walk on eggshells to avoid conflict. So you tread delicately. And that affects children as well, of course, in a family system when they're well aware when mum or dad is coming home drunk, late at night, tiptoeing. To give you an example, I used to years ago work with kids specifically who had some maturation difficulties. And one of the issues that came up quite a bit was bedwetting. And it seems far removed from what we're talking about right now. I acknowledge that. But what I discovered with working quite a few kids was that it was actually a fear of father. They'd rather be in the comfort of their bed and be warm than have to deal with the person who's just coming in because of the historical stuff that may have happened around that. So there's a lot of different boundaries that can be set, but there's a lot, of course, that people end up not even acknowledging they need to have for themselves because it becomes a new norm in someone's life. They could have come from a belief system or a family structure that was very healthy, very pleasant, very loving, where there were healthy boundaries. But after years and years of a certain relationship, you can get well worn down. And so we see a lot of people who are worn down. We have a lot of clients, but the majority of our clients, of course, are people who have addictions as opposed to substance affected. But we do try and see as many people who are substance affected as possible. And Mike has run a group. Each of us have taken turns working with that group. It's called Over the Influence. And it is well worthwhile if any of you have concerns or you want to do deeper work to think about coming to join us for that. If you go online, you'll see they break down the boundaries in many, many different forms. I'm just going to give you some of them and why it's important to establish healthy boundaries. One of them will be no more insults or ridicule. You no longer sacrifice your self-worth, re-establishing the self-respect and integrity that you hold. Addiction distorts family roles. It turns family members into caretakers, scapegoats, doormats, enablers, and pleasers. And you've got to remember that when we talk about having to lie for somebody, one of the problems is that addiction thrives in chaos and lies. And so that becomes one of the big issues, that you end up setting yourself up and you go against your own personal integrity. So if we look at the categories of the boundaries you have here, physical. That's an obvious one, personal space being invaded and touch considerations. And it's very fitting right now with Me Too and everything that's happening there. There's an interesting transition in stuff going on right now that really fits that personal bubble. So a lot of people are considering what does that mean for them personally in all sorts of environments, including the work environment. No politics at the dinner table. That's for thoughts and opinions. Well, most of us know, don't talk about politics, don't talk about money. You know, if you go to the States these days, it's amazing how gingerly we even approach the subject, if you do at all, right? Because it causes people to get very upset. But when you're dealing with someone who has a major addiction, you can get into arguments that are absolutely fruitless because you're not being heard. And we'll get into that in a moment, because we will also be talking about reacting versus responding. And the other one is emotional, your feelings, no name calling. Some of you will be aware of a phrase called gaslighting, or gas lamping it's called sometimes. And that means where you can end up feeling like you're really stupid because someone is constantly on your case, putting you down, and you start to question your own intelligence and wisdom. So there's a lot of violations that can occur as a result. Why do boundaries often get changed with loved ones? Because we often hold on to the memory of the love and relationship before the drug or alcohol abuse began. We had the belief that the addicted loved one can stop doing drugs if they really want to, or if they truly loved you. The lack of understanding of normal drug use versus abuse and addiction. The common misbelief that addiction is a lack of willpower, not a disease or a dis-ease. The dangers of being an enabler. When you allow yourself to live in a household where anger, frustration, stress, and disrespect are a constant state, you are robbing yourself of the quality of life that you deserve. So I'll give you some examples of some boundaries here right now as well. Get a little bit more into the examples of boundaries, because many of them are inappropriate in demanding the addicted loved one stops, or claiming that they must not love you enough if you don't stop doing the drugs or the alcohol use. Examples of appropriate boundaries around that will be, if you end up in jail, I won't bail you out or pay for a lawyer. Now, we've had a lot of people who have come to see us because they've actually used up their entire savings. And sometimes that's been to pay off a drug dealer. Sometimes it's been to pay off an enforcer who says, you know, I'll beat the person up, or I'll kill them if you don't pay up. But they're not usually directly going to the person with the money, i.e. the parent or the partner. That's what the person may hear. That's what the parent may hear or the partner may hear via their son or their partner. In other words, hand me the money. Obviously, that doesn't seem like a very good idea. But the biggest fear that most parents and partners would have is that their loved one is going to end up dead. And so it's understandable why many people would pay over, but it often isn't going to achieve anything, because what can happen is 10 years from now, the same issue is going on with that person. They're just a lot sicker, and you've got no money left because they can always find a dealer. So you have to bear in mind that people used to live and live to use. And this is the hardest part to get over, is because you usually, your frame of reference is usually the person you knew before they really got deeply into this stuff. Another one of the types of boundaries would be, I won't give you any more money for anything. I won't allow any drug-using friends in the house. I won't allow any drug paraphernalia in the house. These would be appropriate boundaries. So let's take a look at caregiving versus caretaking. There's a slide here that will break it down for you. We also have a caretaker checklist. I've got one here. It's got about 40 different items on it. But this one, you can see some of these items. I do things they can do for themselves. I lose sleep. I miss work. I have trouble concentrating because I am worried about my loved one. I neglect myself to the point I am physically ill. I have made choices based on the belief that my loved one will not survive or make it without me. I try to control situations or my loved one's behavior so I feel safe or so my loved one will be safe. I cover to save him or her from negative consequences. I find myself saying things to my loved one like, you need to, and ending up really trying to push something that someone doesn't want. Again, you have to bear in mind that when a person says, or when you hear things like, I'd sell my grandmother for the next joint, or whatever it is they're using, sometimes that's literal. It's hard to conceive if you've never had an addiction, but that can be literal. I feel angry when my effort to help isn't effective. I find myself saying yes when I mean no. And there's one of those terrible things where a person buries their own integrity, so they're not congruent with themselves. And so they're living in this place of duality. I know one thing, but I do another, which is exactly what the addict is also doing. They know one thing, that it's harmful, but they want that immediate gratification rather than the long-term gratification of becoming healthy, sober, productive citizen, etc., etc. So caregiving. When I read this, I actually wrote down a couple of things as well that may sound a little gruesome, but I wrote the words energy leeches and vampire, because some people have described that as what can happen, where you feel drained of all your energy, and someone can feel like a succubus, literally taking all the energy away from you. Where's your vitale elan, or elan vital, right? Your vitality. It gets sucked out. You could have been an extremely vital individual, and your partner using year after year after year, draining the family resources, draining the affection, making Christmas a terrible time of year, whatever has gone on, can make you feel like all your energy has been taken away from you. And that includes the energy of money. It includes the energy of the body's energy. It includes relationship energy, neighborly energy, community energy, not doing the things that you used to do or the things that you would love to do. So it can take away a sense of your own personal drive and purpose, because everything is now directed towards this person and their behaviors and your fears attached to them, even though that person may not have any interest whatsoever in getting well. There's the big difference between caregiving, caretaking as well. If the person has a vested interest and says, please support me in my journey towards recovery, that's wonderful. That's what you would want. But if you keep prodding a person saying, you've got to, you should, you need to, what tends to happen to any of us, that up yours part of us tends to come out, and the next thing you know, they're backing away, or they're taking off somewhere and you don't see them for a few days or a few weeks, or until they run out of money, or until they end up in hospital, or until you get a terrible phone call. These are some of the consequences. So it's a good idea to establish for yourself, what does it really mean? And I love the fact that what it says here is caregiving fills you up. You know what they say, when you need support, the best thing to do is to support someone else. It's very, very true. If you're feeling a bit down, work with someone else. Go out there, volunteer in the community, help someone else get back on their feet. It makes you feel good. There's no doubt about it, because you may not be able to do anything much about your own circumstances at the time, but living in the now and enjoying and embracing what's going on for you and any relationship stuff that you may be having. Helping in ways that make you feel good and do not build resentment. The word resentment means to feel again. We're going to get a little more into that in a moment, but the word means to feel again. If this is the first time you've had an issue with somebody, you're not necessarily going to feel resentment. You just want to jump in and help as quickly as possible. And that may be helpful, especially if they're saying, I realize I'm on a road I don't want to continue going down. Please support me or come along with me in this, sort of hold my hand. Would you come to meetings with me? Anything. But if a person is absolutely reluctant, you can find yourself totally in a caregiving situation or a caretaking situation. So you have to define what is happening here. Are you running around in circles and this person is a central figure but doesn't have to do anything? And that can happen in social situations where somebody has issues and they may have a lot of social agencies involved with them, but they're not doing anything and they don't need to. All the social agencies can be running around in circles trying to get everything in place. But you see, some people are comfortable in their discomfort. I'm not trying to sound negative here, but it's important to understand, and you will certainly after a while, if you tune in to your own intelligence, if you sort of have that independent expert observer part of you that's been around for a long time and observed this situation and this relationship, you should be able to sort of step outside yourself and observe and say, you know, is this healthy? Are we going in any direction? Am I doing all the work here? Do I need to step back from what I've been doing for a long time? So I think these are questions you can pose yourself. No, our job is not to tell you what to do. Sometimes our job is to sort of emphasize things, to allow you to see maybe a bigger picture, because the picture gets smaller and smaller as time goes on, so to speak. Someone's personal life can get smaller and smaller. You feel disconnected, and that can create resentment. And again, resentment means to feel again. Here we go again. So it's a build-up of anger, and it gets compressed over time because there's very little places to get rid of it. You can yell and scream, but the person can just walk out the door, raise their hands and say, see, you're driving me to drink. Now, if you're a publican, I remember going past the old Penticton pub one time, you know, as you go up the hill, and it said, if you're driving your man to drink, please drive him here. Which is, no, it's funny, but it's sad at another level, you know, because what is it saying? It's saying a person cannot deal with emotions, doesn't know how to handle a relationship, is unwilling to talk about maybe the deepest feelings that they have inside. So it becomes a mood-altering substance. It becomes an avoidance of legitimate suffering. It becomes avoidance of any deep connection to another human being, including their kids, including their partner, including their parents. It depends on where you're at. Stephen Covey, 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. So this is one of the statements he made. Our ultimate freedom is the right and power to decide how anybody or anything outside ourselves will affect us. And that includes the addict as well, or the alcoholic. They have a perfect right to move towards their expiry date a lot quicker. They have a perfect right. It's tragic, but it is their journey, and we don't know what lessons may be there en route. The addicts we work with are certainly, in my opinion, some of the most sensitive people you'll ever meet. They've been badly wounded. Whatever that might mean, it can mean so many different things. So if you think about what are the benefits, and it's very important to establish before you get too far into it with a partner or with your kids, to change the question of why. Every behavior has a positive intent. So instead of why, which will rarely get you an answer of any sort from somebody, you can reframe the question and say, if every behavior has a positive intent, you can change that to say, so what good things could this person possibly get from drinking 30 beers a day? From having a cocaine dealer's number at the bottom of their beer glass, or whatever their drug of choice is. So bear in mind, they're all mood-altering experiences. And why would a person need to mood alter? If you think about the 3 greatest stressors, they are fear, they are pain, and they are fear of more pain. So you add those things up and you can understand we're talking about all types of different pain. There's physical pain, obviously. And what happens if you've got intractable physical pain? Like 24/7, there's no relief. You've tried everything. Even the doctor says you've got to put up with it. Here's something you can give yourself every few minutes if you're in a hospital bed sort of thing, or not as bad as that, but it is there 24/7. Or you've had immense amounts of grief. See, some people will have a phase, and it may last a long time, but if you've had a lot of loss in your life, then there may be one loss too many that tips you over and you say, that's it, the world sucks. You may lose a religious belief. The foundation of everything that is meaningful to you could suddenly be eroded or collapsed. There's a word called disfellowshipped, And some of you will relate that to religion, but it can mean anything. It means sudden cutoff from something that was a foundation for you in which you subscribed, believed, or felt connected to. And if you think of fellowship, you can have fellowship in AA, you can have fellowship in any community body whatsoever. You can have fellowship with two mates that go out hunting or cycling. Absolutely anything. But what happens if you're suddenly isolated or you feel abandoned, disconnected? If you read some of the material on addictions, there's some great stuff out there. And one of my favorite books of all time is called Chasing the Scream by a guy called Johann Hari. It was brought up somewhere else here. I was at a talk someone else was giving, and they brought up that book as well. But what I liked about it, it's a Canadian. He did a huge amount of research on what works all around the world and what doesn't work. And the end result for him, looking at all the stories and talking to all the people he met, was that trauma and isolation were the two greatest factors that head people towards addiction. A sense of not belonging. And if you have trauma and it keeps reliving itself and you live with a sense that there's no hope that anything could change, then what's the use? What's the point? Why do we look at existential questions at certain times in our lives when we hit 40, 60, 80, whatever it is, or a crisis occurs? And it makes us stop all of a sudden to reevaluate, who are we? What am I doing here? Where do I want to go? And this can come into, even with your children, even with your partner. How much time, energy of your personal life do you want to give? Can you afford to give without losing yourself? And remember, you really want that partner or person or son or daughter to step over to where you're at. You don't need to go where they're at, and that can sometimes happen. Why am I feeling this way? How to tell? And I mentioned some of these things already, but you see, as it says, you feel angry with yourself for allowing an action. You regret what you did shortly afterwards. You neglect yourself emotionally, physically, or financially to do something for your loved one. Your gut instinct tells you this doesn't feel good or it isn't a good idea, but you do it anyway. The best clue is that you are feeling uncomfortable, resentful, frustrated, angry, or bitter, and you feel taken advantage of. So here's a few more examples of boundary crossing in relationships. A loved one calls while intoxicated and is verbally abusive. A loved one borrows money without repaying it. That's very, very common. Or they repay it and then they ask for more later on and say, well, I paid you the last time, and they may have done that 4 or 5 times. There's plenty of scams out there. That happens to be an international scam, let alone with your own kids or with your own partner. They'll pay you back that first one, they'll pay you back the second one, and they're borrowing more each and every time. A loved one takes your car. How many parents have had their kids take off with their car? Or a person who has an addiction may not have insurance, but they take off with their partner's car and bang it up oftentimes as well. A loved one expects you to drive them around everywhere like you're now a personal chauffeur and you can't have a life of your own. A loved one guilts you into doing things for them. That's a constant. If you loved me, you would. How can I possibly change anything if you're not going to take me here, there, and everywhere? And it's an interesting one because, others will respond and say, well, if it was a drug dealer phoning, you would run 10 miles down the road. And there's a truth to that. How much does a person want change? Remember, they're living in a state of fear often. And there are some people who cannot handle the world. It seems pretty overwhelming at times. The idea of someone who's been in a very deep, addictive state in their life for a long period of time. You imagine someone who's been homeless down in East Hastings for years, and a good person approaches and says words to the effect that, I can make this all change, I can give you a house, we can send you to college. What if you can't read and write? Okay, we've got a literacy program, we'll get you on your feet and we'll set you up, we'll get you a job, and 5 years from now you'll be an upstanding citizen and your health will be recovering. Can you imagine what that would seem like to someone who's living that way? They've been living hand-to-mouth, day-to-day existence, always in the now, never with this, and yet you're asking them to project much time ahead. So a lot of stuff has got to be now. I know some people are uncomfortable with rational recovery, but the good thing about that is that they talk about now, but the power of now, right? We have plenty of books now on this whole thing, and that is what matters. So if someone says to you, I will never now again use anything, just like AA, it's one day at a time, we need to encourage that, because every moment eventually becomes a now moment, but you also have to see that in light of yourself as well. If I am just repeating my own patterns, if I'm an enabler or a caretaker, then what am I doing? I'm doing it for somebody. I'm not teaching them how to do it for themselves. And the last one is obvious because it's another form of theft, of course, without permission. So manipulation strategies. Now, I can't even read my copy here, I don't think, so I'll try and see if I can see that. Attempts to make you feel guilty. Oh yeah, manipulation, this is a biggie, and I'm sure all of you have had that one way, shape or form. The word manipulation, I tend to think gets a little bastardized because I think it's actually a healthy word, but we use it in the context of meaning this is negative manipulation. Every one of us manipulates. So we need to understand that we want the world to work for us, not against us. So that's a form of manipulation. So this is only meant in the sense of negative manipulation, trying to get someone to do something for you that's in their best interest, but not in the best interest of the other party. So I hope that makes sense. Sometimes language can really mess us up. The interpretation, because if you look at belief systems, everything is about our interpretation of certain words, beliefs, the way we grew up, the environmental stuff. So it's important for us to see that those interpretations and beliefs become our operating system. And it's pretty difficult until we stop and do some conscious work on stuff to step back and then change those belief systems and change our operating system. And it happens when we've come up against a brick wall time and time again and we say, something needs to change. And it may be an attitude, it may be a deeper understanding, it may be moving away from having a black and white mindset about anything, because we all know there's plenty of grey area out there. Those who anger you control you. I'm sure everyone's sort of heard that before, so it's nothing new to you. But if you think about what I said earlier about the whys and what good things, the addiction is rewarding in some way. So it's making you angry and it's controlling you, but you've got to remember there's a reward for the other party. So what would happen if you suddenly understood the reward and it changed something? What it would change is looking for something much healthier to get the same intent met. So let's take worst case scenarios, because people often will challenge me on that sort of fact when we're talking about what good things would someone get. And I said every behavior. And people say, what, murder, incest? Yep. It never, ever justifies it. Please understand, I'm not talking about justifying anything. But if you think about what good things does someone get from that, power and control. It's never justifiable, but that's what they're looking for. So if you then turn that around and you look at some of the systems we have worldwide, especially in Portugal, they get people to be productive. They get people to feel powerful because they become decision makers, because their artistry or their sensitivity can have a form of expression outside of themselves. What happens if you bring music into things? What happens if you bring animals into therapy? Things change. We have therapy dogs and cats now in hospitals. Why? Because we understand it's unconditional. Because you're then in the quantum. You're both able to receive and give. Whereas a lot of people, these are one-sided relationships that we're discussing here. Does that make sense for everyone? Do you understand the principle of that? It's like if you are doing nothing but helping somebody who doesn't want help, you're trying to give, but how can you receive anything back? They're not in the place where they can give back, and you're not necessarily open to receive because you've ended up being a giver your entire life. So it becomes difficult for someone even to receive a compliment. And I know I'm going a little off tangent here, but you see how it starts to affect absolutely everything. And you could have spent a week making the best party, getting all the goodies ready for 200 people, and everyone comes along and says, that was fantastic, thanks for all the work you did. And this person said, it was nothing. No, everyone else did the work, I did. And that's sad. And it was a young kid who said to me once, you know what a compliment is? It's a ray of sunshine. And it is, if you think about that, yeah, when someone means it, when they're not just being a sycophant, when they truly mean something, to be able to receive that. So how do you get somebody you love who's addicted into a place where they can then be able to receive and give? It's when you start to subtly make shifts as well, because the power of language, the vibration of language, the vibration of our feelings, if we are holding on to resentment, what is that going to do? It's going to shut us down. All they hear is negative, negative, negative. I'm not good enough. And what does that do? It reinforces all the beliefs they already have up there, shame and guilt. I'll never be any good. I'm good for nothing. And many people were actually told that when they were growing up. So it's very difficult to get that out of your system because, as they say, we are egocentric for the first 6 years of our lives, and therefore we receive this information from the world. And it's not necessarily from our parents. It's for anyone who is meaningful in our lives. How are we impacted so many ways? Look at anyone now, say 25 and below, can be impacted by cyberbullying. It wasn't anything we could think of before. You know, we thought of bullying just at school and stuff, and a lot of people certainly experienced that in residential school stuff. But now you can be cyberbullied. You could be sitting in your bedroom at home isolated and you're getting bullied just by looking at this. It's ridiculous. And so what do we do with that stuff? How do we fit in with peers? Because that's what most people want, is a sense of peerdom. I can go off on a lot of tangents. I was watching the other night this video that was about transsexuals having their own. Did someone see it? It was a great thing. It was like a beauty competition. And I'm thinking, this is wonderful. People from all over the world came to this beauty competition for transsexuals. And isn't it nice that we've got to that point in this world? Because certainly people wouldn't have been stepping out the way they are to say, this is who I am. So that becomes another conflict for some people. Their sexuality is a big conflict, and it was for many, many years, right? So how do you hide these things? Bruce Jenner, one of my heroes, an Olympic champion out of all events, the decathlon. Right, and here he is now, Caitlin. Who would have ever thought, right? So lots of transitions. You can only imagine what he went through or she went through, because it was all recorded on TV as well. We got to watch that entire transition. But most people live alone. And what do we live alone with but thoughts in our head? And even though the thoughts in our head are not real, they're not reality, it can feel like it is. So when people talk about the addictive voice, they talk about it as almost like a committee, the unwelcome guest, or the mocking intruder. And it can be a whole slew of different names they have up there for the addictive voice, but it keeps pulling them back because it remembers the chemistry. Just like the chemistry of love, the first time you fell in love, there's the chemistry of the first time you took a hit of something. And that chemistry is very real. And like all of us, we may have all gone through difficult times, but later on, it's amazing how we can reflect on it, and it didn't seem that difficult at all. And yet at the time we were saying, this is the worst thing I've ever experienced in my life. So our brain has this wonderful capacity to minimize stuff. When people are found on the street and they're overdosing, many of them go right back out there. Despite the fact all of us would be aghast, you know what, I had this near-death experience. But remember, the brain has this capacity to just remember how great it was the first time I ever did this or that. Defending boundaries. How to say no. Detaching from your emotions. My loved one doesn't go to Thanksgiving dinner at a relative's house. So what would you do if this was your neighbor? Nothing. My neighbor can choose to spend Thanksgiving anywhere he wants. You see, if we can get to that point of how to say no, life becomes a whole lot easier. And that the words are not just yes and no. Assertiveness is yes, no, maybe, I'll think about it, let me dwell on that, I'll get back to you on that. There's a load of different ways to say the same thing. It's the same when you totally disagree with someone. Let's say you know from history that you're about to escalate this into an argument with your child or your loved one, and historically it ends up with you throwing things or yelling at each other and you feel wounded and hurt. What if you were just to say words like, oh, you've got a point? Of course they've got a point. It may be totally screwy, it may be off the wall, it may be 100% incorrect, but it's a point. And it sounds like you're almost agreeing with them, but you're not agreeing with them. So you see how even the language of that diffuses something. But it does give you the ability to use a different style of language. And remember, we want to transition the language from reactive into responsive language. The 3 R's, we'll get to that now. This is reacting, communication that comes out of emotion. It's defensive. You will always come away exhausted, having accomplished nothing. Relating is more positive and comes out of a desire to communicate understanding. For example, I understand what you're saying. It sounds like you had a bad day. As counsellors, one of the things we learn early is to reframe. That sounds like, oh, that sounds like. So you will hear us do that quite a bit, or we change the wording somewhat. But basically, that's what we're saying. We're trying to get in there to accentuate the ambivalence that you're living with. And I'm saying you, but most of you are living with ambivalence as well. Sometimes you want to slam the door on the person and tell them never to come back and you don't give a damn. Another time you find yourself crying uncontrollably all by yourself because you're worried sick about what's happening out there. Responding. Reinforcing your boundaries with both words and actions. Communicating in a respectful, positive way. And the respectful, positive way is not just to the other person, it's also to yourself. Because you've got to live with yourself 24/7. You're the only person you're never going to leave or lose in your entire lifetime. And if you don't have a decent relationship with yourself, if you're constantly caught in the quandary of knowing one thing but doing another, where's the congruency for you? But it's a trap of addiction. And it's a trap, of course, of what we're dealing with here right now. So let's take a look at the examples of responding. Your loved one wants you to lie for her and tell relatives at a holiday gathering that you can't make it because she is working, when in reality she is home with a hangover. And the easiest thing to do is sort of give it back in a sense, but say, okay, it's not really my role. I'll just tell someone else you couldn't make it. Don't come up with excuses. That's one of those types of examples. Because the person has to take consequences. If there are no consequences, then you're living constantly in that internal battle. Knowledge will not apply itself. If you have a partner or a child and you want to get something online, let me suggest to you, here's one book that I think is great. You don't have to get the book, but this is by a guy called Bob Myers. And the book is called Get Your Loved One Sober, Alternatives to Nagging, Pleading and Threatening. The combination of reinforcing positive behaviors and allowing the natural consequences of negative behaviors is more powerful than any other strategy. Reinforcing, that is. What is enabling? It means softening or removing the negative consequences of another person's negative behavior, which in effect encourages the continuation of that behavior. There's a place called CRAFT, which is a community reinforcement and family training. And you go online and they've got 2 really good guides in there. And the guides are for parents and for partners. You can download them. And I would urge you to do so. It's interesting reading. But what is it? They develop the programs basically to teach families how to impact their loved one while avoiding both detachment and confrontation. That's what a lot of people are fearful of, confrontation. So even a shift in the word, if you change that word to carefrontation, would that make a difference in the way you therefore acted towards a person? You see, because it could shift, just thinking of the word can shift reacting to responding. If you think of, let's say, this was my best friend I was talking to right now as opposed to my partner, would that shift the way you spoke? If it was someone else's child that you were talking to and not your own, would it shift the way you spoke? So I urge you to think of carefrontation because it can immediately shift the tone of your voice. Remember, a child and a partner is looking at you and picking up body language constantly. They know when you're pissed off with them. They can see a look on your face that tells them everything that fuels their desire to get out there and run and go to the bottle or go to the drugs, to mood alter. The avoidance of legitimate suffering that provides neurosis, right? So if you look at that, are we heading towards that by not being congruent with ourselves, by constantly putting ourselves in situations where we're elevated? My mother used to use a phrase that always concerned me as a young kid. My mother was not a drinker. She was a lady who avoided legitimate suffering for very good reasons, but she used to say words like, "You'll be the death of me." As a young boy, seriously, I had no idea what I was doing that was going to cause her to die. And it was a strange thing. It was only later on when I realized even the teachers are saying that. So, and they weren't saying it just to me, they were saying it to us collectively. So I got the gist of, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought when I was like 4 or 5 years of age. They had no clue as to what I could possibly be doing that was killing my mother. So words do impact us. Craft teaches families behavioral and motivational strategies for interacting with their loved ones. And specifically, they teach several skills, including understanding a loved one's triggers to use substances, positive communication strategies, positive reinforcement strategies, rewarding non-using behavior, problem solving, self-care, domestic violence precautions, and getting a loved one to accept help. So we have the Craft Guide for Parents. I'll just read a few parts from this, if I may. Many teens who decide to start using substances early also struggle with psychiatric problems like depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety problems, ADHD, conduct disorder, or early onset psychotic disorders. Many have learning disorders and academic problems or impulse control problems that lead to relationship, legal, institutional, or authority problems. In addition, teens are particularly sensitive to peer dynamics, including ending friendships, sexual identity issues, bullying, etc., and to stressful situations like their parents' marital status or someone they're close to dying. There's a lot in the mix at that stage of life. What do you do when you're caught up in something? Remember, I just used the word carefrontation, so hopefully you can take a look at how to use pocket responses here. And it shifts the dynamic because you're looking at positivities where possibly there's been no positivities used before. I have confidence in you. I believe you'll make the best decision for yourself. You're very resourceful, and I have confidence you can figure this out. Often someone who drinks a lot or takes drugs is extremely resourceful. You may have been totally unaware how many bottles they've got laying around the house or in the vehicle. Same with drugs. People find money where you wouldn't believe they could find money, or they find things of their own or yours to sell resourcefully without too many people knowing, and years later you realize there's a ring missing or something. So they are resourceful, it's just not being used very productively at this time. But again, if you know what their hobbies are, if you know when as a kid they used to relate to horses or dogs or art or playing guitar, to get them back somehow, that can be part of the goal. When people reconnect with something that was meaningful to them, it's amazing how it can help a person get back in. Some of you know I'm into athletics and stuff like that. You would be amazed at how many people have said to me, and it's not that I've been talking about it, but out of the blue they'll say, you know, I used to run the 800 meters at school. You know, I was the BC champion at this, or I used to, you know, 1,000,001 different things that were physical activity. And when you inquire when they stopped, something usually happened. And it could be peer pressure, but it could be a trauma that occurred. It could be when parents split up, when they lost a buddy in a car accident. There's a whole slew of things. And who is armed with abilities to deal with this stuff? And so it's tough enough for us as more mature adults or older adults or people with a lot more trauma behind us. But if you can remember, what was it like for you the first time the bottom was taken out of your world by someone's passing, someone very significant? That's certainly your prerogative. See, that's an interesting one, because they may be saying or telling you they're going to do something negative, and you're saying that's certainly your prerogative. It's just like saying you might be right. You have a point. See, even you might be right is a good one. You know they're not right, but they might be right. Could be you're screwed up. Could be a flat earth after all. Right? I'm just going to live under a bridge somewhere then. You see how that's immediately throwing guilt right back at you, and how terrible that would make you feel if the person said that to you. But that's the manipulation again. They're trying to protect themselves because they'd much rather use and have a roof over their head and know that you're going to make them a meal and wash their clothes and give them money when they run out of money and buy them cigarettes when they need cigarettes to complement the coffee. And please, I'm not knocking people who are addicts by saying this. This is just the nature of the beast. And remember, we said part of you is connecting to the person they were before this all began. And that person is still there, but people get lost in that. They've got to want a change first. And even when people go to treatment centers, it's been established that we tend to think someone has to want to go to a treatment center in order for it to be successful. It's not the case necessarily. Many people have gone to treatment centers reluctantly, but have stayed and have done very nicely. Treatment centers are the beginning of something. They're not the end of something. We will often have people come to us and they sit with their arms folded. You can't teach me anything. I'm here because maybe probation or my wife sent me, or I have no idea why I'm here. I only use so many times a week or something. And they'll put their arms, sit sort of like this. And nothing wrong with that until we sort of say, well, if everything's fine, we're only here to support you in whatever your goal is, so you're quite welcome to leave if life's going well for you and you're happy with it. I've personally never had anyone leave at that point, because you're trying to say, we're not here to tell you you're bad. It's not bad. The behavior is not good for you. What damage is it doing? What's the toll? What is the impact? What is the cost? Because if it's separating you from everything you love, everything you used to love, maybe in sport or anything else, and your family, what are you going to gravitate towards? Anything, anyone that actually is willing to take you in, and that can be a drug family. It can lead people to a dealing, of course. So hopefully you get the idea of pocket responses. It's trying to say, it's trying to honor the other party, say the child or the partner, and saying, did you know you're the world's leading expert on yourself? I may be a good mind reader and I may tell you I know exactly what you're thinking, but honestly, you, the individual, is the greatest knowledge in terms of how you think and what you do. So how can you get that person to begin to use their knowledge is by using healthy affirmation towards them, positive words, because you want to see small change. It's not healthy to go 180 degrees overnight. Putting the plug in the jug is not the answer, it's the beginning of the answer. But a lot of people will walk out. If we said, so you've got to be abstinent, so you've got to quit tomorrow, people would walk out the door and not return. So we have to talk in terms of harm reduction. Are you willing to look at the possibility of, say, for 2 days, checking what it would be like not to have this? You get the person to tell you what they would look like. So I had a client once drank 32 beer a day, and I thought that was remarkable. For me, 32 beer, I can drink 2 or 3, and it's like, wow, no, thank you very much. I couldn't have another one, but 32 a day. And so when we discussed moderation, there was a big gap between what I thought was moderation, because I didn't tell him what I thought was moderation, but he said, I'd like to be a moderate drinker. So I said, so how much are we talking about here then? He said, if I could scale it down to 15 to 16 a day, because see, that was 50%. Now, that is a damn good goal initially. It sounds awful. If someone went back home and said to his wife, he told me I should drink 15 to 16 a day, which is not what I was saying. I was just agreeing that's a good starting point, but that's how it would come across to this person. They interpret it any which way that sounds positive, right? I can still drink 15 or 16 a day. But remember, from that point on, if things start to look a little positive, if the person's been sick and they start to get a little better, even having an operation, even having a near-death experience can shift someone's mindset. But of course, you don't want it to get to that point. But we always talk about what is the person's bottom. They've got to bottom out. What does that mean? It means so many different things to different people. So remember, you can only control your behavior, not theirs. You may decide to take a personal breather, like a timeout, if the communication is not healthy. Now, Mike runs that group, and they have a page, a personal breather page, in fact, how to establish those. And I think I have a copy of it here I'm willing to share with people if they want to look at that. Respond instead of react. Who is responsible for this? What is my responsibility versus someone else's? Create your own pocket responses so you can actually write them down for yourself. Rehearse them if you wish to. Do a little role play, but not with the other person, of course. So resentment. I've spoken about this already a bit, but I think you get I hope you get the gist of resentment and what it really means, because it's a mixture of disappointment, anger, or fear. It can be triggered by an emotionally disturbing experience, and you've got all the emotions in there. Remember, many addicts continue to disgust themselves. Many are really living in a place of despair and disgust. There's a whole slew of contradictions, ambivalences, dilemmas, quandaries, and ironies. I actually just typed up a paper on all the ones I could think of. And I put from euphoria to U-Haul. And what did I mean by that? Well, the euphoria being how good they can feel, but the U-Haul is, I have to leave the family. You know, it can totally destroy your life. From dopamine to divorce. Again, chemistry. It's biopsychosocial spiritual. You have to remember that. There's a whole load of subcontext to it. Is the person a mentor or a tormentor? What do they have living inside in that inner voice? Because if you look at what's it going to take, well, actually it takes having a friendly voice inside. It takes walking around with someone you treat as a friend, right? This person inside, this voice inside. If you can shift that voice, not that you're going to do it, but you are going to complement that, you can make it possible by the person hearing different things, reflecting on them, and deciding to respond rather than react, because you're not being demanding in the same ways or pointing out things about them that they already know. None of us need to know we're bored or we're fat or anything. We already know these sorts of things. Well, an addict knows. They're not ignorant of these things. I have a saying on the wall in my office. It says, alcohol gave me wings to fly, then it took away the sky. And a lot of people can relate to that. It held out so much promise. It was like a loving mistress, but now you're enslaved to it. It's become a dominatrix, if you like, right? A person becomes a substance slave or a process slave. So it's a forfeiting of personal freedom. And there's a whole lot more. I think maybe if we can even post this on our website, some of you will get a gist of what I mean. But again, our role as counsellors is oftentimes to accentuate the ambivalences of stuff that's going on for clients. So remember I mentioned about beliefs, perceptions, interpretations becoming your operating system. So how can you have a better future if all of your beliefs and reactions are based on the past? So you've got to be thinking about now. That now is the moment of power. The other thing is effectiveness is the measure of truth. All that matters is what works. There's placebo, there's nocebo, and there's everything in between. That's why some people will go to 20 detox centers, treatment centers, and it may be a passing statement someone makes and it changes their entire life, and you never know when that can happen. That may sound ridiculous, but you, as a counsellor, we could be saying something to someone 50 times. We think we've said it in every possible way. And they may come in one time, you say, you know, I ran into my buddy. We were sitting having a chat and he said this, and I get it. That's it. It's over. I don't want to ever use it again. You know, and you go, oh, that's wonderful. And it is wonderful, of course. And it's maybe providence, serendipity, whatever it is. It's meaningful coincidence, but it's wonderful when it happens. But let's look at what the Buddha said. Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one getting burned. You would never hire a poisoner to be your personal chef, right? And that's what we're doing when we've got this stuff going on inside. Now, there's a wonderful fable. It's called The Bridge. We have copies of it. I would urge you to take it with you and read it. It's a wonderful fable. It allows you to sort of step inside your own world and visualize yourself in that situation, because many of you may find yourself in that situation, and it helps you realize it needs to be together that this can be done, not you trying to do it for the other person. I urge you to read that. Heroin can feel like a warm, soft hug. Some of my clients have told me it's like a warm blanket, so it makes sense. Now, you see what I said about dopamine and divorce? Dopamine, vitality, motivation, incentive, curiosity. This is what that provides. Remember, I was talking about élan vital and the loss of vitality. So you could be getting drained, whereas the heroin user is getting hyped up and feeling wonderful. Cocaine releases 300% dopamine. Crystal meth, 1,200. Alcohol is used for both solace and celebration, and everything in between. There's no end of reasons why someone will want to use. James Baldwin, the great writer, said, it is both an affliction and a crutch. And there is that great dilemma again. Addiction provides predictable relief and power in an unpredictable and painful world. It's an expression of despair. Hurt people hurt people. So if you are dealing with stuff yourself and you look at your environmental stuff, you will often find that there's a wounded person maybe in your family or that was significant to you growing up. They're reenacting things because they've never found a resolution to them. Post-acute withdrawal syndrome, I have something on that. A lot of people aren't fully aware of the impacts of that, but it is something that one should read up on. If you have a partner or loved one that's withdrawn, please check that out. It will help you understand what goes on in the maybe a couple of years afterwards. The most identifiable characteristic is the inability to solve otherwise simple problems. There are 6 major types of poor symptoms that contribute to this. The inability to think clearly, memory problems, emotional overreactions or numbness, sleep disturbances, physical coordination problems, and stress sensitivity. So when I refer to clients coming in and knowing one thing and doing another, all that simply is self-sabotage. And self-sabotage comes from the French sabot, which means shoe. Originally, that was someone threw a shoe in the works and it all shut down. So you see, that's what's happened to a person. They've shut down. We talk about maturing, but physically, they can't stop growing, of course. They can mature physically, but emotionally, they are often stuck. The engine has stopped really working. So you may think you're talking to a 50-year-old partner or a 15-year-old child, but you may be talking to someone who's at the maturity level of a 14-year-old when they first started using heavily, or a 6-year-old when they were traumatized. So please bear that in mind as well.